Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week-by-week basis. And today's topic of discussion is mental health. And on the conversation on mental health, I'm talking about the two-part series in boundary setting, and the second one is about advocacy. And I think advocacy is such an important element of mental health that we don't talk about enough, and nor do we assume enough agency and responsibility for our advocacy. And I think that is really important because a lot of the times we will allow different people to speak on our behalf, even if they're speaking out of turn. And so I'm very, very intentional about personal advocacy. I think that there's different ways that we can advocate for ourselves. I think that it's often the case that people don't recognize that they're breaching a boundary when they're trying to advocate for you without a lot of the information or without any information in order to support or substantiate the things that they're saying. And it can be really very detrimental. And so I want to have this conversation today around advocacy. And so advocacy can translate in so many different ways. You can be the one who advocates for your health. You can advocate for your career. You can advocate for your goals, for the things that you're aspiring to. You can advocate for your family. Like, there are so many different ways that advocacy really does translate. And I think that it's really important that we recognize that when it comes to advocacy in and of itself, it's when you're using your voice to speak up and to create a position that will have an impact on that person, have an impact on the trajectory of whatever it is that you're advocating for. So whether that's for human rights or whether that's for that person's personal rights, whether that's for their health. I mean, advocacy is when you're leveraging your voice in a way that it's going to be influential, it's going to have an impact. And so if you are trying to advocate because you have all these great intentions, but you're misinformed, you can do more harm than good. And so I think that it's really important that when it comes to advocacy, we set the rules of the game for how and when we want ourselves to be advocated for, or for how and when we advocate for ourselves, and how that translates. And so a lot of how I myself became cognizant of the concept of advocacy is when I worked in an HR tech firm. So I did have a time in my career where I worked with an HR tech firm, and in that career I worked with a lot of people who were within the realm of mental health. Within the realm, they worked within clinical psychology. They supported around different topics and themes that do with mental health. And a lot of those conversations that I was privy to, or a lot of the training that we had around how we supported people who were fully functioning but dealing with different themes that had an impact on their capacity to perform at work, or how they advocated for themselves, how they spoke on their own behalf, how they represented themselves. It meant everything, right? And so because of that, I recognize that when it comes to advocacy, there's so much that can be said with your voice or with silence. Silence can be its own form of advocacy. And sometimes when you choose to not confirm or deny something that's being said because you recognize that the best move forward is to let the narrative play out and then to advocate for yourself once all of the pieces are known, like that is its own form of advocacy. Not always is it the case that someone requests an answer from you at a specific period of time. Is that the appropriate time for you to advocate for yourself? Time and place means so much, especially when you feel like there are different things that are being said that are going to paint you in a specific light. And if you want to maintain a neutral stance, if you want to make sure that you give the narrative an opportunity to run its course, and then at that point you can leverage silence as a means of advocating for yourself until you're ready to state your position. So in that case, advocacy is super, super critically important. And when it is the case that you're choosing silence as a form of advocacy, as a form of self-protection, as a form of positioning, then it's really important that the people in your community recognize that that's the advocacy that you're choosing. And in that realm, they should follow suit. And in all cases, if it is a case that you're seeing that someone is trying their best to advocate for themselves with silence, and then you decide that because you have some degrees of separation for them, because you know them for some period of time, that you're going to speak on their behalf, then you're probably hindering or infringing on their sense of advocacy, because advocacy doesn't always mean speaking up. It could be very intentionally not speaking at all, not confirming or denying the narrative, but instead positioning yourself to be able to properly defend yourself or deconstruct the narrative, especially if it's false. So that's really important. Another form of advocacy is, of course, speaking up, but speaking up from a place of being informed and also being in a position where you can really speak intelligently and articulate yourself by way of not only what it is that you're experiencing, but also what it is that you need. And I think that this is a form of advocacy that is too often underrated. It is really important that we think very intentionally about how we represent ourselves, how we advocate for ourselves, whether we're advocating for ourselves by way of our health, recognizing that our voice matters, that an expert doesn't know you more than you know yourself, that an expert who's trying to pigeonhole you or put you in a box because the expert is not paying attention, right? They're not paying attention to your symptoms. They're not paying attention to the things that you're going through or the things that are happening around you. And sometimes, like, you hear a lot of people who have to go to 2 to 3, maybe 4 doctors or 4 medical professionals before they get the appropriate diagnosis, but only because that person decided to advocate for themselves, not to be complacent in the face of an expert part who is not really looking to listen or to hear their point of view. So I think advocacy is just such an important tool in our toolbox when we recognize we're not being heard. And it's important that if it is the case that you recognize that you're not being heard, but then someone's ready to provide you with a treatment plan or with a roadmap, but they haven't actually heard you, and you feel like, okay, well, maybe there's a disconnect here, and how comfortable do I feel with someone confident in providing, next steps when they haven't properly heard me and are not interested in hearing me? I think that's really, really important. And this is not just, again, in a healthcare theme. This happens like professionally. This happens personally. If ever it is the case that you're trying to advocate for your wants, for your needs, for your desires, you're trying to advocate for what it is that you know you require for whatever trajectory you're moving forward, then if you're not met with open ears, or if you're not feeling like you're being heard, then at that point you need to recognize that advocacy in and of itself, there's a disconnect, right? Like someone cannot be offering you next steps or offering you a solution if they don't fully comprehend the problem. And I think that it is too often the case that we find ourselves feeling complacent, or we find ourselves feeling helpless when it is the case that we're trying to communicate what it is that we need, or even we find support to try to communicate what it is that we need, and we don't feel like we're being heard, right? Or we don't feel like maybe the response is in alignment with the severity or the depth of what it is that we're trying to communicate. And all of that can be really difficult and really challenging to navigate, but it's important to try to navigate it nonetheless, because advocacy is important. If you don't speak up for yourself, you can't expect anyone to be as invested in you speaking up for yourself and you getting the things that you're looking for if you're not yourself doing the same thing. So advocacy, I think, in the way that we speak up and the way that we articulate and position ourselves and the way that we defend ourselves is just so important. And we have to make sure also, as it relates to advocacy, that we're involved, that we're speaking to the right audience. And sometimes the right audience is a specific person within a given realm or within a given domain. And sometimes it is the case that if we're met with deaf ears, if we're met with people who aren't trying to understand or not looking to understand, that they have their own agenda, that means that our advocacy is misplaced in the setting that we're in. We need to find ourselves in a different setting for our advocacy to have the impact that it's looking for. It's not always going to be straightforward. It's not always going to be easy, but it's always going to be necessary and your responsibility to advocate for yourself. And it's not necessarily going to be something that everyone understands. And I am someone who, again, I have been very intentional about advocacy, and I recognize that sometimes advocacy requires silence. Sometimes advocacy requires me to use my voice, or sometimes advocacy requires me to build a team of support in order to be able to push for me to be able to properly position myself to be heard. But it's never going to be something that I can offload on anyone else, right? Advocacy is something that is individual to each and every one of us. Like, we have to own our own sense of advocacy, and people can support us, of course, but they can't take that role from us. Like, we are the ones who are the dominant player as it relates to our own sense of advocacy. And I think advocacy is also really important for us to protect our sense of self-worth, or protect our sense of self-respect, protect our sense of growth and evolution. Like, if someone's trying to pigeonhole us or put us in a box and we don't advocate for ourselves, we don't defend ourselves, we don't speak up against those kinds of microaggressions and oppression, then how are we going to move forward, right? And not just ourselves personally, but how are the people who are walking in our footsteps or going to follow up behind us also going to move forward? So I think in all of those cases, advocacy is just so integral. Now, if you are interested in learning more about advocacy and how you can be an advocate for yourself, if you're focused on self-mastery and inner alignment, then definitely join in on our live events. We do host live events at least twice a month, every month for the foreseeable future on our website. So definitely be sure to check those out. Now, these events are paid events, so if you do see yourself joining our community on an ongoing basis, and I do suggest that you take a look at one of our package plans. Yes, so we do offer package plans over and above our live events, as well as access to webinars and workshops largely focused on self-mastery over and above these events. So check it out, be part of our game changer community, being part of the change that you want to see, allowing us a small role to play in your journey. Now, we are on the road to 1K. We do also provide via our website access to parent-child workshops, so workshops that will enable you to focus on cultivating those leadership skills in your children. And so these are 4 key modules focusing on cultivating a sense of self-concept, of autonomy, self-advocacy, and compassion, core tenets that we feel will create the leaders that tomorrow needs. So if we have piqued your interest, definitely tune in, leave us a like, follow us, and we look forward to chatting with all of you very soon. We'll talk to you later.